Hello, welcome to the self-learning platform by Dr. Sushma Singh. Today we start Unit 4, Early Nationalist Responses. Rammohan Roy, Bankim Chandra Chatterjee, Dayanand Saraswati and Jyotiba Phule. Today we are going to discuss nationalist response, a critical appraisal and then summary of the unit. Another major characteristic of the early nationalist response is the way the nation was conceptualized. By avoiding reference to Muslims, these nationalist thinkers seemed to have clearly identified the constituents of the proposed nation. By drawing on exclusively Hindu traditional traces like Upanishads or Vedas, the early nationalists identified the source of inspiration for the nation at its formative phase that clearly set the ideological tone in opposition to Islam and its supportive texts. Their idea of nation had therefore a narrow basis since Muslims hardly figured in the conceptualization. The explanation probably lies in the historical context characterized by the declining, decadent feudal culture supported by the Muslim rulers on the one hand and the growing acceptance of the values of European modernity on the other. Apart from Bankim, who had strong views on Muslim rule, none of the early nationalist thinkers articulated their opinion on this issue in clear terms. What drove them to embark on a nationalist project was the mission or revamp and revitalize the Hindus who failed to emerge as a solid bloc due to largely to an inherent divisive nature. Whether it was Dayanand or Bankim, the idea of consolidating the Hindus as a race seemed to have acted in a decisive manner while articulating their response. Given his interest in Persian literature and Islamic culture, Rammohan held different views on Bankim. Since Phule was critical of the dichotomous Hindu society, he argued in a reformist language, and reference to Muslims did not appear to be relevant. In his perception, the British rule was providential simply because it provided him with intellectual resources to combat the archaic practices in Hinduism. What is evident now is that in articulating a nation, these thinkers discharged a role that was historically conditioned. It would therefore be wrong to simply label them as partisan due to their indifference or critical comments on the Muslims and their rule. By critically endorsing the British rule as most appropriate for the nation, they were persuaded in two ways. First, the Enlightenment philosophy provided an alternative system of thought to critically assess Hinduism and traditional scriptures on which it was based. Secondly, by drawing upon the civilizational resources of the nation, these thinkers had also articulated an intellectual search for a model that was socio-culturally meaningful for the constituencies it was conceptualized. In this sense, the idea of nation, though narrowly constituted, seems to be a product of historical circumstances in which they were placed. There is a final point. Their response was hardly political. While Dayanand eschewed politics altogether for the Arya Samaj, Rammohan was concerned more with eradicating the evil practices in Hindu society. Bankim's historical novel Anand Math had a political message in his support for the sannyasis rebel against the ruler. Although his ideas of state and state power are not so well developed, his argument for the spiritual superiority of the East seems to have given him an intellectual edge over other early nationalists. Phule was also reluctant to essay the role of the Satyadok Samaj in political terms. What was central to him was that to challenge the Brahminical hegemony over the Shudras, who constituted a majority. Given this well defined priority, Phule scripted the role of the Samaj accordingly. Furthermore, the avoidance of a clear political rule was perhaps strategically conditioned in a context when an anti British stance was likely to draw government attention. In other words, apprehending damage to the mission they undertook, these thinkers were persuaded to adopt an agenda allowing them to pursue their ideological mission without governmental intervention. Despite all these, the ideas they floated galvanized the masses into action. When the nationalists confronted the British government for a final showdown, not only did they inspire the extremists, they also provided intellectual resources to Gandhi and his followers. So, the early nationalist response forms an integral part of the nationalist thought that was differently textured in different historical circumstances, depending on what was central in the nationalist vision. Now, let us sum up the unit. What runs through the early nationalist response, whether Ram Mohan, Bankim, Dayanand, or Phule, was the concern for massive reform in Hindu society that lost its vitality. Given the fractured nature of Hindu society, it would be difficult, if not impossible, they argued, for the nation to strike roots, let alone prosper. Drawn on his liberal values of British variety, Ram Mohan welcomed the foreign rule as a significant step towards radically transforming the Hindu society by injecting the basic idea of enlightenment. With an uncritical faith in Gita, Bankim found in Anthician Dharma an appropriate device to galvanize a moribund nation, while Dayanand distinguished himself from the rest by depending exclusively on Vedas. Phule appeared to have been influenced by Western enlightenment in articulating his views on reform. There is an implicit assumption in what they wrote attributing the triumph of the British to the divisive nature of Hindu society. While Bankim endorsed Western superiority in the material domain and hence their success, he, however, drew on the spiritual resources of the Hindu in instilling a sense of identity. Interestingly, this was the running thread in the writing of Rammohan, Dayanand, and Phule, but privileging conceptualization are different. Seeking agenda figured prominently, and the distinction between us and them was pursued consistently to develop an alternative nationalist discourse. Now we want to end up this lecture and we have come to the end of the unit. Thank you so much for your attention.